So, I gotta be honest, I was never on the Merab Dvalishvili is becoming the greatest bantamweight ever train. And that's not a mark against Merab. He is clearly one of the greatest fighters of his era, and his ability to maintain a pace is truly something that will probably be remembered long after he retires. But even if he had beaten Peter Yan in their rematch, and after the recency bias died down, I think there would still be a large number of people that would say that Dominick Cruz is still the greatest bantamweight of all time. And since Merab did indeed lose that fight, I truly believe this narrative of Merab being the greatest bantamweight of all time will die down. The main reason I say this is, well, I personally have seen this narrative before about whether the current bantamweight champion has surpassed Dominick Cruz in the all-time standings for over a decade at this point. I'll explain why I think Dominick Cruz will probably always be considered the greatest bantamweight fighter in a second, but I feel it's important to explain how often this conversation has happened. First and foremost, I think the greatest fighter of all time discussion is silly. Heck, the majority of the debates over who is the greatest athlete of all time in any sport is silly. There are so many intangibles and contradictions and whataboutisms that will derail almost any of these debates. But with team sports, it is a little bit easier, because eventually the best teams have to play the other best teams. And in combat sports, you don't really have that because of weight classes. Now, of course, you can try to counter that with, well, that's what pound for pound is for. But honestly, I have not even seen a true clear consensus of what pound for pound actually means. It's supposed to mean best fighter regardless of weight class. But if you sit down and really give yourself a headache thinking about it, the laws of physics immediately counter this notion. A man the size of Brock Lesnar is never going to be able to move around the same way a man like Demetrius Johnson can. And on the same token, a man like Floyd Mayweather Jr. is never going to punch as hard as a man like Mike Tyson did. And that's why I also think double champions in MMA are also kind of ridiculous. The vast majority of fighters that have changed weight classes to achieve champ status do so because, well, weight cutting sucks. Conor McGregor was never moving back down to featherweight after winning the lightweight title, nor was DC ever moving back down to light heavyweight after winning the heavyweight title. Same goes for Henry Cejudo. Now, Amanda Nunes was a double champ that did move up and down to defend both the women's bantamweight and featherweight title, but let's be honest, women's featherweight was never really taken seriously as a division in the UFC. And it's not like Amanda Nunes bulked up or anything to fight at featherweight. She just didn't cut weight the same way she did for bantamweight, because the talent pool in the women's featherweight division was so shallow to the point of not even having an official ranking system ever. I say all this because the greatest of all time isn't largely based on merit. To put it plainly, it's largely based on vibes. I think everyone has their own unique criteria of what constitutes the greatest of all time in anything, and it's always completely subjective. So then why am I even making this video then? Well, the thing about greatest of all time vibes is that divisionally, it's a little easier. But even then things can get really subjective at times. Jon Jones should easily be considered the greatest light heavyweight ever, but some will disqualify him because of his past use of steroids. Same with Anderson Silva and him being considered the greatest middleweight ever, even though he popped after he was champion. Georges St-Pierre absolutely should be considered the greatest welterweight of all time, but people have brought up that his title reign being largely born decision affairs as a knock on him, as opposed to someone like Kamaru Usman having a largely very exciting title reign, combined with the winning streak he was on. And I've been in the greatest bantamweight of all time discussion trenches ever since Dominick Cruz tore his ACL in 2012. Believe it or not, for a period of time, Renan Barão was thought to have been the greatest bantamweight of all time, and also one of the greatest fighters ever. He had 3 title defenses, and while 2 of those defenses were considered interim title defenses, by every reasonable metric, those defenses were just as good as regular title defenses. He was a dynamic finisher who could submit or knock his opponents out, seemingly had great cardio, and he was on a 30-fight winning streak. Almost nobody even considers him a top 3 bantamweight of all time now. His fall from grace is one of the most drastic and frankly depressing in MMA, as the Baron was truly something to watch in his heyday. Then there was TJ Dillashaw, who himself was pretty close to taking the mantle from Cruz, as he had 2 championship reigns, beat top contenders, and totaled out to 3 title defenses as well. But he lost to Cruz, and of course the whole EPO thing. I think the narrative around Aljamain Sterling being the greatest bantamweight ever was pure hyperbole and never truly taken seriously. And again, nothing against Aljo, he is most definitely one of the greatest bantamweights ever, and also had 3 title defenses. But man, that title reign was weird. The Dillashaw and first Yan fights aren't really his fault, But aside from those fights, he didn't really have an emphatic or dominant championship either. And then, well, that brings us to Merab. Now, for my money, that the UFC copyright hounds love to take from me, Merab is the second greatest bantamweight. His resume, his incredible year as champion, and his dominance within that short but impactful championship reign will echo on forum discussions and ChatGPT bots chatting with each other on Facebook. However, like I mentioned previously, this has happened before, and I think I can predict where the tides are turning. You see, Dominick Cruz passed so many of these vibe checks that Merab simply doesn't. And it's extremely silly and kind of dumb, but I'm a vegetable man talking about MMA and you are probably on your lunch break or something. Sometimes the world just works out this way. Merab fights, by and large, are very samey. And I don't mean to knock the guy or say he is boring, because some fans are genuinely entertained by his relentless pressure style. But his fights are repetitive. Sure, his striking has gotten better in his most recent fights, but his rematch against Jan showed that when he has to rely on his striking after the threat of his takedown pressure is nullified, he is still very limited. Dominick Cruz fights would often go to decision, but he was extremely well-rounded, and his striking was just as fluid and fascinating to watch as his takedown entries and ground control. Now, here's the thing about his and Merab's resumes. They are pretty equal in many ways. In fact, I'd probably argue name for name Merab does have the better resume, but I think history will still be more kind to Dominick Cruz's resume in the future. Merab's victory against Jose Aldo is extremely contentious. I don't think the Sean O'Malley wins are going to age all that well. The Umar win is probably the best win of Merab's career, so you can't take that away from him at all. And I think the Sandhagen win is solid as well, but I don't think many people will particularly remember that fight. And if he loses the Peter Yan again in their trilogy, for a lot of people that completely undoes Merab's dominant win in their first fight. And then, well, that's kind of the whole Merab story. I mean, he's a goofy character with a unique charm, but I don't think that translates into actual interest on a fighting level. Dominick Cruz's story, however, is what continues to elevate him and keep him relevant as the greatest bantamweight ever, in my opinion. Dominick Cruz has his dominant run at bantamweight in the WEC promotion before the UFC absorbed it, which in of itself is a great narrative. Cruz also has his rivalry with Team Alpha Male, where he continued to conquer their fighters until Cody Garbrandt put a stop to it. This rivalry includes his 2 wins over Joseph Benavidez, avenging his loss to Faber, and his incredible title comeback win against TJ Dillashaw. And speaking of that comeback, for Dominick Cruz to lose 3 years of his prime and his title due to injury, come back to put a generational beating on Takeo Mizugaki in his return fight, lose another nearly year and a half to injury, and then come back to reclaim his title from one of the top pound-for-pound fighters in TJ Dillashaw, and then closing out his trilogy with Uriah Faber in dominant fashion, it's an absolutely miraculous undertaking. While he was clearly never the same after the loss to Cody Garbrandt as his body continued to give out on him more and more, having those 2 late career wins, including his fight of the night performance against Pedro Munoz at the end of 2021, and being competitive against Chito Vera in his final fight before getting viciously knocked out, gave him a very appropriate and cathartic end to his career, something neither Renan Barão or TJ Dillashaw had, that's for sure. Cruz as a personality is also very fascinating. He is a polarizing persona no matter how you look at it, and personality goes a long way in remembering a fighter. Like I said, Merab is a goofy guy, but his presentation is more of a shtick. With Cruz, you got a very intellectual, visceral, and sometimes genuinely unnerving guy that you either hated, loved, or was at least fascinated by. And that's a kind of personality that sticks with you. In fact, a lot of who Cruz is and what he has done in combat sports has stuck in the minds of many an MMA fan. And ultimately, I think at the end of the day, that's what determines what keeps a fighter, or anything for that matter, as the greatest of all time in someone's eye. There's nothing more powerful than how something makes you feel. And until a bantamweight fighter comes along that makes you feel the same things that Dominick Cruz did while he was on top of the sport, I don't see anyone really taking that mantle from him. But hey, that's just an opinion, and this is just a coffee break.